I'm Charina Garcia, and I'm here with Charlie Oppenheim, and we welcome you to our April 2025 live Visa Bulletin webinar. Apologies for having to reschedule it to this week, but we're here today. And so, Charlie, would you like to say hello?
Hello, pleasure to be with everybody today.
Just some preliminary things, like we've always said before. If you have any questions and you want to reach out to us directly, please feel free to do so. And today, what we're going to cover is number use and limits. So, the Visa Bulletin and the number use and limits. The April Visa Bulletin that had come out most recently, Charlie's prediction and trends, and some of the questions that we've received from our audience members. So, with that, let's start with our employment based number use and limits. And what we did here with this slide was we wanted to show you from fiscal year 2016 to fiscal year 2025, which is the fiscal year we're in right now. So, just as a reminder, the government's fiscal year starts on October 1 of each year and ends at September 30th. So this fiscal year started on October 1 of 2024 and it will end on September 30th, 2025. So we're right now in fiscal year 2025. So Charlie, you want to walk us through these number use and limits?
Sure, as you mentioned, we see the 2016 through 2025. In the past, people have asked about, will the new Trump administration have any impact on number use? And historically, if you look at his previous term, fiscal 2017 through 2020, you'll see that number use was approximately at what the annual limits were. So during his first term, we were using basically all the numbers with the exception of 2020. And the reason that was lower was because of COVID. You will also notice that during the COVID period, primarily fiscals 21 through 23, the annual limits were at all-time record highs. And this was because any unused family numbers from the previous year were added to the 140,000 minimum employment limit. And since the State Department processes most of the family cases overseas and those offices were shut, there were large numbers falling across. So unfortunately, some people during fiscals 21 through 23, because of the high annual limits, were somewhat used to the final action dates moving at a very rapid pace. And this was because of the artificially high limits. You'll notice beginning in fiscal 2024, now in 2025, we're returning to the historical limits. I would expect for fiscal 2026 that the limit should be in the 145,000 to 150,000 limits. So again, we're basically returning to the normal limits.
So were you at Department of State during fiscal year 2016?
Yes, I was chief of the immigrant visa control from January of 1998 through December of fiscal 2021. So the early 2021 dates, I was responsible for making the determination of those dates. And again, I retired through the first quarter of fiscal 2022.
Okay, gotcha. So can you just explain to us? So I see these numbers, like something as simple as when you were there, fiscal year 2016, the annual limit is 140,338, and the number use is higher, 140,350. That's okay, right?
Yes, when we're doing the determination of the final action dates, you're doing so well in advance. So the September dates are determined in early August. So when you're doing those September dates, you're having to make estimates of how many numbers you believe will actually be used during the month of August and also September. So it is almost impossible to land exactly on the target. The Immigration and Nationality Act allows you some leeway in going over slightly or being slightly under. And during my time, I believe from fiscal 2007 through my retirement, with the exception of the COVID year, typically we were within 1 to 2% of the annual limit in terms of number use. So we were maximizing number use on an annual basis on the employment categories.
So what happens when you don't use all the numbers? So for example, for fiscal year 2019, they weren't all used or fiscal year 2020? What happens to those numbers?
Unfortunately, those numbers are actually lost because, as I mentioned earlier, any unused family sponsored numbers from the previous year are added to the employment limit for the next fiscal year on top of the minimum 140. Any unused employment numbers from the previous year are used in the calculation of the family limits. But during that calculation, the unused employment numbers are actually irrelevant. So, in a sense, they're wasted. So that's why the attempt on the employment side is to be as close to the annual limit as possible. And in some years, we would see that we were actually over. I believe in 2014 or 15, we may have been up to 2,000 numbers higher. Again, because of the way that the September dates are established, having to make estimates.
Yeah, but you look at fiscal year 2021 and the annual limit is 262 and they only used 195. So what happened to those?
Unfortunately, those were lost. And again, in fiscal 2021, although the limit was higher, the Immigration Service was also feeling the effects of COVID in terms of processing that year. And so that had a negative impact on number use. Luckily, USCIS made a very strong effort to make sure that they maximized number use under the limits for fiscal 2022, 23, and they're still doing so now.
Can we get back those 60,000 that we lost in 2021? That's a lot of numbers.
Unfortunately, they are, quote, lost unless Congress were to act and recapture the numbers. Unused numbers can be recaptured, but it requires legislative action. This was done in 2001. Approximately 130,000 numbers were recaptured for use. And in the Real ID Act of 2005, 50,000 numbers were recaptured and used to address the nursing shortage that was taking place at that time. But again, any recapture of numbers requires congressional action. And my guess is there are probably over 140,000, maybe 150,000 plus employment numbers that potentially could be recaptured for future use.
So would have to lobby Congress to get
Yes.
to get a bill passed so that we can get those 140,000 numbers back.
Yeah, and I think the 140 would be a minimum, but again, that congressional action has only happened 2 times in the past, so it's not an easy thing to do.
Okay. Well, I mean, if you could get the 140,000 back, you basically would almost double because we're at 150 normally in a fiscal year.
Correct. The minimum employment limit is 140,000, so we'd be back essentially to the limit that occurred during fiscal 2022, and that would have a significant positive impact.
Yeah. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So this is really important because we get a lot of questions as to what is the per country limit. Per country meaning country of birth, right? And so the ones that have the biggest backlog is, of course, India being first and then China being second. And, when I was in a webinar yesterday, the big question is why is the wait take so long, right? And so, Charlie, this kind of illustrates, and our next slides will also illustrate why the wait takes so long. So why don't you kind of walk us through this chart?
Yeah, the per country limit, Congress established a 7% per country limit, and that is 7% of the overall employment limit. And Congress did so to prevent a handful of countries from monopolizing the use of virtually all numbers. In the family sponsored categories, if there were no per country limits, Mexico and the Philippines could use virtually all of the family numbers. And if there were no per country limits in the employment categories, India, China, the Philippines, and Korea could use virtually all of the numbers. Primarily, India and China could use virtually all the employment numbers. Again, you will see during the COVID period, the extremely high employment first, second, and third preference limits. Those limits were artificial. And again, they allowed for the rapid movement of the final action dates for India and China. And that was a very good period of time because it did alleviate a lot of the quote backlog of applicants who were waiting for visas at that time. But again, you will see the limit for fiscal 2025 is approximately half of what the limit was in 2022. And it's basically returning to the normal 40,040 limit.
So basically, the limit for fiscal year 2025 that we're in is 150,000. That's the estimated. And then for each category, there's a limit of 42,900 total. And then for each country, there's a limit of 3,000 for each country.
Yes, and the way it is, the employment first, second, and third preference categories each received 28.6% of the overall 150,000 limit, and that results in the 42,900. And then 7% of the overall limit goes to each of the China and India preference categories as well.
Yeah, and I think we might have a slide that shows that. So let's go to the next slide. So this is an example of the China number use, right? So we had talked about the per country limits, and then where you see the NAs, why are there NAs there?
For whatever reason, the State Department has not yet published any data regarding fiscal 2024 number use. It's unfortunate that they have not done so because it really is important for the immigration community who is looking at this information to have that available and have the transparency by State Department posting the data. Hopefully, it will be posted at some time in the near future. But my guess is that the totals for 24 and 25 in the second and third preference categories will be very close to the per country limit for those categories. In the employment first preference category, it will be slightly higher than the per country limit for India in 2025. So I believe that India for fiscal 2025, although the per country limit is 3,003, my guess is India will use in the 5,000 range, hopefully more, and that China number use will be in the 3,000 range.
Okay, but let's just walk through this chart because if the per country preference limit is 3,946 looking at fiscal year 2023 and China used 7,007, right, for EB1, is that
Right.
correct? And then for EB2, 6,371, and then EB3, 4,218. How did China end up using more?
In those fiscal years, what will happen if there are going to be otherwise unused numbers under the annual limits? So, just to make the math easy, for example, if the overall limit were 40,000 and China and India were entitled to 2,500 numbers each, India and China would use 5,000 numbers. From the 40,000, that would leave 35,000 to be used by the rest of the world. If the rest of the world only needed 30,000 numbers to remain current, then those extra 5,000 could be provided to China and India because they would be considered to be otherwise unused, and otherwise unused numbers can be provided to any country which has already reached its per country limit in a particular visa category. And again, this allows number use to be higher than the actual per country limit. And also, there are occasions where there are unused numbers. For example, unused first preference numbers can fall down for use in the second preference category and potentially fall down into the third preference category.
And when we say the per country preference limits of 3,946, that includes dependents, correct?
Correct. Each applicant in a case requires the use of a number, and each number is deducted from the overall limit. So again, if there's a principal, a spouse, and two children, that's the use of four numbers under the annual limit.
So really, if you say that there's a family of 4 and the per country preference limit is 4,000, then really you're only covering 1,000 workers.
Exactly. And we've seen over the years, I remember one time the amount of applicants, for example, in a third preference category case, where typically we would assume it was about 1.5 applicants per case. But over time, as the waiting period expanded for applicants in the third preference category, that 1.5 applicant per case estimate went up to well over 2 and 3 applicants per case. Because again, the longer the people wait, the more likely they are to acquire a spouse and potentially children as well.
Yeah.
The waiting list is kind of a domino effect. The
Yeah.
the longer the wait, the more applicants you often have in line.
Yeah. So we could go to the next slide. And then this is the India number use, right? And so you can see very similar for fiscal year 2023, 3,946. And then the numbers used significantly higher than China for EB1, 16,604, and then EB2, 4,301, and then EB3, 4,782. And we'll kind of walk through a slide, right, Charlie, of how they were able to use the otherwise unused numbers.
Yeah, if you look at the fiscal 2022 data, you'll notice that the India per country limit, or any country, was 5,636. Yet, because of the fall down of unused numbers, India was able to use 59,431 numbers. So they used over 10 times their annual limit. So during the COVID time, we were able to address a lot of the backlog and move a lot of cases along, which would not have been processed otherwise. And the wait times we're seeing now would have been much worse had it not been for the COVID period.
Yeah. All right, let's go to the next slide. And then again, this is just Charlie calculating out so everyone understands how these per country limits are calculated. Because we always get the question, why is there such a huge backlog for China and India? So do you want to walk folks through this calculation?
Sure. So, based on the overall 150,000 annual limit, 7% of that would be 10,500 numbers for individual overall per country limit in all 5 categories. So that 10,500 in the first, second, and third preference categories would be multiplied by the 28.6% limit, which is imposed for those categories, resulting in the 3,003 limits. In the fourth and fifth preference, they only receive 7.1% of the limit. So that means there is only 745 numbers available in the fourth and fifth preference on a per country basis. Again, sometimes we benefit from the fall up or fall down. So any unused employment fourth or fifth preference numbers that are unused under those limits can be added to the employment first preference limit. And if all the numbers available in the employment first preference limit are not required for use, those unused numbers can then fall down to the employment second preference category.
So each country usually starts at around this amount, the 3,000.
Yeah.
And then let's go to the next slide. And so this is an example of China, right? And we have the 3,003 per country annual limit and what actually happened for China based on otherwise unused numbers. So this is just a visual, right, Charlie?
Yeah, this is just to kind of throw it in your face, show you exactly why the dates are not moving. People are asking, well, why aren't the China dates and the India dates moving? And this will illustrate you've got a 3,000 limit and you've got demand of almost 14,500, little over 18,000, and a little over 13,000 versus 3,000 numbers available. So again, this shows you why both the China and India employment first, second, and third preference dates are moving very slowly last year, this year, and can be expected to continue moving slowly next year because the amount of applicants and these totals are just increasing all the time.
So, I mean, if I were just to look at this and I say, okay, there's an annual limit of 3,003, not even thinking about the otherwise unused numbers, and I'm EB2 China, right, born in China, and it's at 18,170, aren't I waiting like 5 years at
Yeah,
least?
you've got a 6 year wait if you were to file today. And we see it a lot of times in the second preference category that people have been waiting so long in the third preference category that they've gained additional skills, which, although they originally filed in the third preference category, their skill set allows them to upgrade to the employment second preference category. So that often adds to the second preference waiting list.
Yeah.
So again,
Yeah.
these indicate potential wait times.
Yep. All right, let's go to the next slide. And then we always talk about the otherwise unused numbers. This is where the 3,000 can actually go up. And so Charlie's just going to walk us through just the calculation they use on how they determine whether there are extra numbers to use.
Right. So the State Department would have looked at the beginning of the year. They see, okay, the first, second, and third preference limits are 42,900. They know that India and China, that their per country limit is 3,003. And they know China and India will reach their per country limits. So they subtract the 6,006 from the 42,900. They then make an estimate of how many numbers they believe will be required by the applicants from the rest of the world, and they subtract that. And in this case, they will find, okay, they estimate that there's going to be 6,000 unused numbers under the overall preference category limit. So they can start making those 6,000 numbers available to Indian and Chinese applicants, but where those countries have already reached their per country limit, they would make those 6,000 numbers available strictly in priority date order of the applicants.
When do they make this calculation?
They could make this at the beginning of the year based on historical data from the previous year, but they would continue to monitor this throughout the year to see if their estimate of rest of world number use is accurate. And they may have to adjust that 6,000 figure up or down as the year goes on. And that would maybe have an impact on the movement of the dates for either China or India.
Which could explain why the numbers moved in April, which we're going to go through.
Correct. These unused numbers, which is what has allowed India and China to use numbers in excess of their annual limit in earlier years and allowed the final action dates to be advancing at a somewhat more rapid pace during those earlier years.
Okay, so if we go to the next slide, this is where there are no numbers available.
Right here, where they're doing the same process. They start out with the overall limit, knowing India and China are going to use all their numbers, but they've estimated, okay, the rest of the world is going to require the use of all the numbers. We've seen in recent years, there is a rest of world second and third preference final action date, which means the rest of the world is going to use this limit. So when it subtracts out, it shows there are no otherwise unused numbers available. Therefore, there are no extra numbers above the per country limit, which can be made available to China and India employment second preference category. And this is what is limiting the movement of the India and China dates, second and third preference dates during fiscal 24, is continuing to limit the movement in 25 and will continue to limit the movement in 26.
But if you said that you typically make this calculation in October, right? And so if we're not then if there's really no otherwise unused numbers, then the dates for China and India simply aren't going to move.
Correct. This is going to potentially limit number use going forward.
Yeah. And we'll walk through the Visa Bulletin so you could kind of see all of this in play. But let's go to the next slide. And here we go. We're going to the Visa Bulletin. So
Yeah.
family based. So everything we talked about was about employment based. And so the numbers are very, very different for the family base, but we still kind of show a slide to show the movement going on. And I think the main story is that F2A, which is the spouse of the lawful permanent residence, isn't really moving, right?
Yeah. Yeah. We haven't seen any movement in that. And based on that fact, probably won't see a lot of forward movement in the F2A category. But the positive sign in the family first, 2B, third, and fourth preference categories, there has been fairly consistent forward movement of the final action dates, which is a positive note for anybody waiting in the family sponsored lines.
Okay, and if we go to the next slide, this is where we start talking about the employment base. So this is the final action trend for rest of world, or what we always call all chargeability. So EB1 continues to remain current and will continue to remain current. EB2, these are our national interest waivers or the master's and bachelor's plus 5 folks. And we saw good movement since February. It moved a month in March and then it moved another month in April. And then EB3, there was no movement. And then it moved about a month in April. So, any comments about this?
No, the fact that the employment first category remains current is very positive news for Indian applicants because this means that there are going to be otherwise unused numbers under the employment first preference limit. My guess is the reason that State Department had withheld movement of the India first preference state was to make sure that their estimates that there were going to be unused numbers were accurate before they started moving forward. And in the employment second and third preference category, I believe that they're still using a kind of adhering to a policy of making their biggest movements on a quarterly basis for the first half of the year. So heavy movement in October, January, and again, then for April in the second preference, they needed to make a slight adjustment for the month of March. But again, these green arrows are a positive sign, but nobody should ever assume that they're just because they're seeing forward movement, say for the month of March and or April, that that will continue in the future. I would not be surprised if the dates slow down in the coming months.
Yeah, and then if we go to the next slide, we see China, right? So again, EB1 isn't moving. It's still at the standstill. It's been like that since October. And then we see EB2 and it moved. So and it moved significantly because we went from April in February 2025 to October most recently. So now it's at October 1, 2020. So it moved about 6 months from April to October. And then EB3, we see movement since January and it's inching its way, June, July, August, and then it jumped a few months in November. So since December of 2024, it's moved up over 6 months. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think in the first preference category, the fact that China Employment First is held indicates to me that they're using all available numbers under the per country limit. This first preference date is not likely to move in the future. If it were lucky enough to move, it probably would be relatively minor. I'm a little bit concerned that the dramatic movement in both the China employment second and third preference categories that it has moved for so much for the month of April. If I were doing it, I would have preferred a more limited movement. I'm concerned that this large movement for April increases the likelihood that the future dates will be held or that they could have retrogressions in the China employment second and third preference dates at some point in the coming months.
Yeah.
So it is very important for anybody that's eligible to be always acting in a very timely manner and don't attempt to reschedule your case if you can avoid it at any cost, because although you may be eligible for the month of April, you don't know what's going to happen for May or June.
And we're starting to see interviews again for employment based. So that's also for the adjustment of status folks. Attend your interview. Don't reschedule. Let's look at the next slide, which is India. So India, okay, now we see EB1 moved a little bit by 2 weeks. And then we're seeing good movement also happening in EB2. So November 2024, it starts moving in December. And now we're up from July to January of 2013. And then EB3 was at November 2012 and moved up to April 2013. And this had been inching along, right? So movement of a month. And also for EB3, that's like 3 months, almost 3 months, right? So that's pretty big movement going on here for India.
Yeah. Again, the movement of the first preference indicates that they're starting to move it forward slowly because of otherwise unused first preference numbers. As I mentioned with China, I'm a little bit concerned with the movement of the India employment second and third preference dates. I think these movements increase the likelihood of future dates either being held or retrogressing at some later point. The only potential positive news with these movements is that their estimates of number use based on previous movements has been extremely low. They estimated that the previous movements were going to use far more numbers. So they've made the drastic movements now to increase number use. But I would be surprised if that were the case in India and China, where in the second and third preference category, you were likely to have fairly sizable amounts of applicants in the weekly or definitely in the monthly groupings.
But when we talk about otherwise unused numbers, we see it actually probably in play here in the EB1 for India, right?
It is definitely happening in India, yes. But
Okay.
again, there's such they have such a large amount of pending applicants. They know that they could essentially they could hold the India date until sometime in the summer, at the end of the summer, and they know they have enough demand. They could hold the date until then when they have a much clearer picture about the amount of unused numbers that are going to be available, and they could still maximize number use because they have so many Indian first preference applicants ready to go. They have the same situation in the India employment second and third preference category, where you have a large amount of applicants waiting their turn for the movement of the final action dates. So when I was chief, I would prefer to move the dates forward at a slightly slower pace until I could be absolutely sure that there were going to be enough otherwise unused numbers remaining available to accommodate the applicants. And that's why I would often hold the dates for China and India until the summer months and have larger movements at that time. Because in my consultations with USCIS, I would say, okay, get these cases ready because I think that I may be moving the dates. So if you have to request additional evidence or information from the applicants, do so that they're ready to go if I move the dates in the summer. Again, that was a more measured so I could make sure that, that if the estimates were low in terms of number use earlier in the year, that those would remain low throughout the year and wouldn't suddenly be a surge of applicants coming forward. I think we've seen that in the employment fourth preference category, where the annual limit has already been reached. I think there was a surge of applicants with very early priority dates that had not been accounted for based on the earlier movement of the fourth preference dates.
But because we know EB2, all other rest of world is already backlogged, then there's not going to be any otherwise unused numbers for EB2 India.
No, the only unused numbers would be potentially if there were fall down of unused numbers from the family sponsored categories, which could be added to the employment per country limits. But those numbers for India are relatively small on an annual basis. The amount of China numbers falling down unused from family sponsored was slightly larger. But again, there's a lot of applicants competing for those numbers.
Yeah. Okay. And so if we go to the next slide, this is your predictions for final action date movement. Again, this is through April 2025. So we'll have new estimates. This is average monthly movement through April 2025. We'll have new ones for the coming months. But why don't you walk us through this?
Yeah, these were the estimates, and these were over the course of several months. I think these estimates proved to be accurate. Actually, some of the movements exceeded. When I do predictions on the movement, I knew people would look at things, and even though they were told not to make plans that they would see, oh, he said it's going to be 2 weeks at a time, they would think that that's going to happen each and every month, not necessarily be an average over the course of 3, 4, 5, 6 months. So again, I think these proved to be accurate, and I will be coming up with new estimates in the future. But again, I would always rather be a little bit conservative and somebody be happy that my prediction was exceeded, not see that it wasn't met.
Yeah, and I think we saw some big movements, right, in the last April Visa Bulletin. So we might not see as much movement, I guess, in May. Is it?
Right, and that's where I said where they were often moving the dates on a quarterly basis. Instead of 3 two-week movements, they might have 1 6-week movement.
Yeah, which kind of is aligned with your 2-week movement, per month. Um, I think the other thing to note also is that, dates for filing is still closed. The USCIS is not accepting Chart B. They stopped using Chart B, I think, in was it
February.
February, and we don't foresee that opening up because of simply they're heading towards the second half of their fiscal year, and the numbers just aren't gonna be there for them. So, we can go the next slide. This is about our our forecasting and reporting. So, a lot of the stuff that we're doing with Charlie, we use his, like, 2 weeks, and we actually will forecast, for our clients and try to determine whose dates could become current in the coming months. So if you're interested in that, please reach out to us. And then we have another sample of our forecasting report that's basically for billing purposes. I think people start looking at their budgets starting in the summer and then towards the fall. So if you're interested in that, please reach out to us. And I think we're going to move to the questions. And we have one question live here. Charlie, for these per country limits, oh no, we answered that. Do they include dependents? We answered that. And then could you also mention how much backlog there is for these categories versus the limits?
Typically, the State Department publishes a waiting list of cases they have on file at the National Visa Center. They do so. The report is as of November 1st of each year. Unfortunately, despite the fact that they would have had all the required information by the middle of November, they have not published yet the NVC waiting list report as of November 1st of 2024. It would be extremely useful to be able to see that information, see how many cases were waiting overseas. But the waiting list unemployment categories is very excessive and it is getting longer because, as I mentioned earlier, India and China are subject to their per country limits, and there's way more applicants in the line and for more additional applicants joining the line all the time.
Yeah, and I think because they won't publish their numbers, we have actually talked to some organizations, like public interest think tanks that actually have done what's called a Freedom of Information Act, a FOIA request to ask to get the numbers from the government. So that's a means to get it. But for some reason, we're not sure. They're not publishing the numbers they normally would publish. And then another question live, if the travel ban from 43 countries, does that impact the date movement?
If applicants are not able to appear for their interviews, use the numbers, then it would potentially impact the movement of the final action dates because if they're not as using as many numbers as anticipated, they will move the dates at a faster pace to maximize number use by those applicants who can use the numbers. This is kind of a wait and see situation. Nobody can really give you a definitive answer at this point. It's too early in the game to see what the impact will be.
I think, though, what we can anticipate seeing is because of the whole government efficiency and the destaffing of offices and embassies and consulates, that's probably where we'll see more of a slowdown of even their ability to get an interview, right?
Yeah, and this may have been one of the reasons behind the movement of some of the dates earlier in the year. If the State Department, in consultation with Immigration Service, were to determine that staffing levels may not permit the use of larger amounts of numbers in later in the fiscal year, they may have been trying to front load things so that they could maximize number use earlier in the year and have less potential for unused numbers later on if a staffing situation occurred.
Yeah. So let's move on to some of our questions that we've received in the past. Are there any changes expected to the H-1B visa criteria and or processing? H-1B registration lottery was just run, the first round. Our percentage are actually quite high. So we're looking at some of our clients having 45% selection rate. So, we're not so sure how the process will look like because it's the first time we're submitting the applications. Of course, they're to be submitted starting April 1 until June 30th. What we saw historically, in Trump 1.0 was a lot of requests for evidence on level 1, wages, but all the wages are still the same and the leveling charts are still the same, so we'll just have to wait and see if we get more RFEs. We saw more RFEs on specialty occupation, what truly is a specialty occupation. The one change that did happen for the H-1B modernization rule is, actually a benefit for those who are under cap gap, where their OPT expires or STEM OPT expires after they submit their H-1B application, they can actually extend that up until the USCIS approves the application. So it's extended all the way through next year. So it's important that they go to their school and get an updated I-20. Question 2, do you think that the Trump administration may stop adjudicating I-140 applications if there is a processing backlog? Um, so the I-140s are fee-based, right? And so they actually will they accept the fee. There's also a premium processing fee of 2,805. We have seen them suspend premium processing in the past, and so it's just regular processing. When they suspend premium processing and they don't allow you to pay the 2,805, then it just goes into the regular queue. What tends to happen is the regular queue just gets more and more backlogged. I think the backlog right now is at about 10 to 12 months. And so we don't know. Would they suspend? I think for a government that needs funding, I don't think they would because 2,805 is a good amount to accept for 15 business day processing. I don't think they'll stop altogether. I think they'll just simply slow it down like they've done in the past. I think what we're seeing now, just so everyone knows, perm processing, which is not a fee-funded program, is currently at 18 months, and we're thinking it's going to go even longer. Um, and so if it takes longer for a perm to get through the backlog and the process, then it takes longer for an I-140 to get processed. If they suspend premium processing, it just means it's going to be longer time frames and longer delays that people are going to be sitting. Um, and honestly, waiting for their priority date and things like that. Um, Question 3, recently USCIS has been accepting Department of State's employment-based filing dates, but for February they chose not to. Can you explain why?
Yeah,
Ye
the Immigration Services policy is to accept an adjustment of status application. Numbers have to be, quote, immediately available. Immediately, for their definition, means that they can process the case to conclusion by the end of the fiscal year and resulting in adjustment of status. In February, they determined that they already there'd been a combination of numbers already used and enough petitions already filed to utilize all the available numbers so that they did not need any more applicants filing based on the Chart B.
Yeah, and so what typically happens, and we've seen historically, they will close Chart B at around February. So usually our office is quite busy. October, they will move, advance the dates. So we're usually busy October, November, December, January, and then February they'll close down. And then from there, we just watch the final action dates. So we're not filing any adjustments. We're just waiting to see the cases we already filed when the date becomes current and then when they actually adjudicate it and we get green card approvals. There's a question here live why Congress doesn't allow the agency to use all the green card as soon as possible, as this would allow applicants to know in advance that their dates will not become current for the fiscal year and make other plans rather than waiting. So I guess this question is like just use them all up in the month of October?
The Immigration and Nationality Act has a section which imposes a 27% quarterly limit so 27% of the numbers can be used in each of the first 3 quarters. The remaining 19% used during the final quarter. Uh, the intention of this is to kind of spread things out a little bit over the course of the year, in part, and probably in large part, that there's just not enough staffing to handle. If they gave out all the numbers in the month of October or November, the cases still wouldn't be finalized until later because both neither the State Department nor USCIS has the resources to process everybody in a given month or two. So therefore, they spread the workload out over typically roughly a 9-month period of time.
Yeah, so it's by statute. We can't change statutes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can't change that. And then if all the green cards are used by February or March of each year, this would mean we know for sure no wasted green card, and also applicants can make plans early rather than waiting until the end of the fiscal year to know if they will become current.
Yeah, but again, as we saw in the earlier slide, number use has been maximized under the annual limits in most fiscal years. And again, although number use would be earlier, you'd still have people sitting around. So it, some people would be happy with it, others would be extremely disappointed.
Yeah. And then there's another question. EB1 India was current until December 2022. How can we explain that's taking 3 years to get back to that date? Is it just EB1, EB1C? Let's see what Porters is.
The fact that
Oh, people that are moving. I see. I think Porters means like people who were in the EB2, EB3 line and then moved up to EB1, which we are seeing. Yeah.
right, another thing is in earlier years, not all of the available numbers in the employment fourth preference and in some earlier years, the fifth preference were not being used, and those unused numbers could fall up to the employment first preference category and be added to that overall limit. Plus, the amount of rest of world demand in employment first was not as great at that time. Neither is happening now. And it again, uh, so the date has been imposed both for China and India, and you should expect to continue to see final action dates imposed for both China and India employment first preference. The current status is not foreseeable.
I think if you just really look at it, in terms of supply and demand, at that time in 2022, the demand wasn't as high, right? And so there were extra numbers to be given, which we call otherwise unused numbers, to our, India, applicants who have, been waiting in the queue because it's always based on, the earliest priority date, and it just so happens that the earliest priority dates happen to usually be the Chinese and the Indians because they've been waiting, in line for so long. Do you anticipate application filing dates in the coming months or for fiscal year 2026?
It is, I would not expect anything. It is possible that the State Department may announce some advancement of the application filing dates in the summer months because the State Department would start utilizing them to notify applicants who are processing overseas so they can generate demand for cases that would be processed in the new fiscal year. The USCIS will not allow the application filing dates to be used for the remainder of the year. For adjustment of status applications, Chart B, the first time you could expect it to be utilized again is in October.
Okay. And then how soon can we file before expiration? Is it still 6 months? I think this is a question for anyone who's trying to renew their H-1B. Yes, it's still 6 months. That's just the statute. That's what it says. You can only file as early as 6 months prior to the current expiration. But of course, if there is an amendment and something has changed, there's a slight change in the job duties, then you can file an amendment, and you can file an amendment at any time. So that's how we get around the 6 months, is when we talk to our clients and we ask them if there's been any change to the work that we can actually file as an amendment versus an extension. Based on the recent trend of EB3 Philippines moving forward 1 month a quarter, do we anticipate to consistently see a similar pace? This is, of course, this question is likely for our healthcare industry. So, Charlie, any response to that?
I believe that the Philippines employment third preference will continue to track with the rest of world third preference date. Uh, in a best case scenario, we will see continued forward movement, but I would be very hesitant to assume that will happen. I would be in a wait and see mode for the movement and just hope that it continues to be moving forward.
Okay. Did you see the filing dates moving for the different categories significantly? First preference nurse, only one movement for this fiscal year.
Yeah, typically the application filing dates, which are announced in October, will remain in effect for the entire fiscal year. They will not move them forward because those dates are announced in an effort to generate enough demand to utilize all available numbers during the course of that fiscal year. So, unless they underestimate or the demand is less than they expected, they would not change those dates during the course of the year.
Okay, and with that, we're at time. So want to thank everyone for joining us. And any questions we didn't answer this time, we'll answer the next go around. So thank you for joining us.